The Cold War was often fought in the hushed corridors of safe houses and the sterile rooms of interrogation centers, far removed from the thundering tracks of nuclear trains or the silent orbits of space shuttles. In the autumn of 1985, the CIA achieved what many in the intelligence community considered a holy grail acquisition. Through a series of high-stakes maneuvers across the divided streets of Vienna, they successfully exfiltrated a man whose name remains redacted in many declassified files, but whose impact was felt like a seismic shift in the halls of the Kremlin. When he arrived on American soil, he wasn't what the public imagined a defector to be. He didn't arrive in a stolen MiG-25, nor was he a high-ranking diplomat with a briefcase chained to his wrist. To the casual observer, he looked like a mid-level bureaucrat, a man of gray suits and tired eyes. But in the world of espionage, he was a systems insider. He was a high-level strategist within the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, specifically tasked with the psychology of command. He didn't just know where the missiles were hidden, he understood the invisible architecture of Soviet power. He knew how a marshal of the Soviet Union would think, how a junior officer would react to a false alarm radar signature, and exactly which bureaucratic levers would move or jam during the countdown to a nuclear exchange. To the CIA's Directorate of Operations, he was a walking, breathing archive of Soviet vulnerability. He represented the human software behind the military hardware. To Moscow, however, he was something far more dangerous. He was a traitor who understood the internal deception practices of the Politburo. He knew that the Soviet bear was often a house of cards held together by bluff and bluster. The KGB placed a liquidator order on his head before his plane had even cleared European airspace. He was a time bomb, and both sides were counting the seconds until he went off. The initial debriefings took place in a reinforced facility in rural Virginia, a place where the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of recording equipment. For 12 hours a day, the defector spoke, and for 12 hours a day, American analysts listened with growing disbelief. He didn't provide just secrets, static data like coordinates or serial numbers. He provided weaknesses. He pulled back the curtain on the Potemkin village of Soviet military readiness, structural flaws in command. He revealed that the dead hand system, the automated nuclear response, was far more prone to glitching than the West had feared. He described how the chain of command was so paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake that in a real crisis, the Soviet response might be delayed by hours of bureaucratic infighting. Missile readiness protocols. He explained that a significant percentage of Soviet ICBMs were theater-ready only on paper. In reality, the liquid fuel systems were corroding the silos, and the maintenance logs were being falsified by officers desperate to meet impossible quotas. Internal deception, Maskirovka. He detailed exactly how the USSR used inflatable tank decoys and wooden missile replicas to fool American satellites into overestimating their conventional strength by nearly 40%. The impact was immediate. NATO analysts later admitted that his testimony forced a total reassessment of the window of vulnerability. The U.S. realized they had been playing a game of chess against an opponent who was missing half his pieces, but was very good at hiding it. Based on his intel, the USSR was forced to quietly spend billions of rubles restructuring several strategic programs to fix the holes he had pointed out. He was effectively dismantling the Soviet defense from inside a Virginia basement. But as the weeks turned into months, a shadow began to fall over the sessions. The analysts noticed a change. The defector's voice grew thinner. The walking archive was beginning to run dry, and with every secret he gave away, his value to his protectors grew smaller. By the spring of 1986, the atmosphere in the safe house had shifted from high-stakes excitement to a grinding clinical routine. The defector had given up the crown jewels. He had mapped the minds of the Politburo and the silos of the Urals. But as the information flow slowed, the asylum upgrades he had been promised, the new identity, the house in the suburbs, the financial security, seemed to stall in the gears of the American bureaucracy. The defector began to withdraw. He started refusing the morning sessions, claiming intellectual exhaustion. He stopped asking for the Russian-language newspapers he once devoured. Most tellingly, he stopped asking about the extraction plan for his wife and daughter, who were still trapped in a Leningrad apartment under the watchful eye of the KGB. He began to spend his afternoons staring out the window at the Virginia woods, a man caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. During one particularly tense evening, a senior CIA handler tried to coax more information out of him regarding the Soviet submarine fleet. The defector didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the handler and asked one single question that chilled the room. What happens when Moscow decides I'm no longer useful to you? When the archive is empty and the secrets are all spent, who is going to keep the KGB from my door? It was a question of cold mathematical logic. He knew the world of intelligence was a marketplace. He had sold his country for protection, but that protection was a service that had a diminishing return. To the Americans, he was becoming a spent asset, a high-maintenance guest who no longer paid rent in the form of classified data. To Moscow, however, the debt was never paid. The KGB never stopped looking. They were patient. They knew that a man without a country is a man who eventually begins to miss his chains. The fourth, the psychological trap of the spend-down. The CIA handlers were trained to deal with many things: interrogation, surveillance, encryption, but they were ill-equipped for the spend-down syndrome. This is the psychological collapse that occurs when a high-level defector realizes his value is finite. In the beginning, he is treated like a king. He is the most important man in the room. But as the intelligence is extracted, he becomes a burden. He is a security risk that requires 24/7 protection, a legal nightmare for the State Department, and a constant reminder of a betrayal that he can never take back. The defector was a master of psychology. He saw the shift in his handler's eyes before they even realized it themselves. He noticed the slight delay in his requests for books or specific foods. He noticed that the senior analysts were being replaced by junior officers who treated him more like a case file than a human being. He began to calculate the half-life of his safety. He knew that the Soviet Union, despite its structural flaws, had one thing the Americans lacked: a long, unforgiving memory. The CIA might protect him for 5 years, perhaps 10, but the KGB would wait 20. They would wait until the Cold War was a memory. They would find him in a grocery store in Ohio or a park in Maryland. This realization created a paralyzing paradox. To stay in the West was to wait for an inevitable, lonely end. To return home was to face a firing squad. But in the twisted logic of a man who had spent his life in the shadow of the GRU, there was a third option, a gamble so dangerous it seemed like madness. If he returned voluntarily, if he redeemed himself by claiming he had been kidnapped or that he had been a double agent all along, he might save his family. He might trade his life for theirs. The message that was never sent. For decades, the standard playbook of the Cold War was written in blood and betrayal. When a high-level Soviet intelligence officer crossed the wire, the reaction from Moscow was as predictable as the ticking of a clock. There would be a flurry of encrypted cables, the activation of wet-work teams, and a relentless campaign of intimidation, blackmail, or assassination. The goal was simple: eliminate the leak and terrify anyone else considering the same path. But in this case, the silence from the Kremlin was deafening. Years later, when the dust of the Soviet Union's collapse had settled and the heavy iron doors of the archives in Moscow were pried open, historians and former intelligence officers stumbled upon a series of declassified files that defied everything they knew about the KGB's inner workings. There was no official retrieval order, no Directive 9 or liquidation request had ever been signed by the chairman. There were no intercepted communications showing hit squads moving through European capitals. No threats were delivered to his doorstep in the dead of night. No blackmail, no mention of his family held in a dacha outside Moscow, and no poisoned umbrellas waiting at a bus stop. Instead, the defector received something far more disturbing than a death threat. He received a message, not through a courier, but through the very intelligence he had brought with him. It was the ultimate psychological checkmate, proof that his defection, his great escape that he had planned with such agonizing care for 3 years, had been anticipated by the center years before he even made his move. The documents he had stolen were a masterpiece of intelligence gathering. They contained names, dates, and deep-cover operations that should have crippled Soviet networks for a generation. Western analysts at Langley and Vauxhall Cross had pored over these papers for months, hailing them as the Rosetta Stone of Soviet signals intelligence. They celebrated the defector as a hero, a man who had finally given the West the upper hand. But they were looking at the surface. They were looking for the what. The defector, sitting alone in a safe house in the Virginia countryside, began to look for the why. As he reviewed the microfilmed copies he had retained for his own protection, he began to notice a subtle, rhythmic pattern, a ghost in the machine. It wasn't in the text itself, but in the way the information was organized, the specific omissions and the inclusion of certain low-level bureaucratic details that seemed irrelevant to a Westerner. It was a language of shadows. It was information that only someone who had been raised inside the claustrophobic paranoid halls of the Second Chief Directorate would recognize. It was a signature. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Western analysts hadn't missed it out of incompetence, they missed it because they lacked the cultural DNA to see it. He, however, saw it clearly. The documents had been salted. They were authentic, yes, but they were curated. The defection hadn't been prevented because it was allowed. The Soviet apparatus hadn't tried to stop him at the border because they had spent years grooming him to be the perfect delivery system for a specific set of truths and a specific set of lies. He hadn't escaped the labyrinth, he was still standing in the center of it. And if the KGB had let him walk away with these secrets, it meant only one thing. He was the smokescreen. His defection was a massive, loud, and public diversion designed to validate certain files while obscuring others. He had been used to authenticate a narrative that would protect someone else, someone far higher up, far more dangerous, and still active within the very agencies that were now protecting him. The weight of this realization changed the air in the room. The defector looked out the window at the rolling American hills, realizing they were no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. He was a liability. To the West, he was a font of information that was now tainted. If he told them what he had discovered, that their prized intelligence was a Soviet-engineered plant, he would be discarded. To Moscow, he was a loose end that had served its purpose. But more importantly, he realized that the contingency plan mentioned in the salted documents wasn't a political one. The Soviet state didn't care about the political fallout of his defection anymore. They were playing a much longer game, a personal one. If he remained in the West, the pattern suggested a series of events would be set in motion that would destroy not just him, but the people he had left behind and the people who had helped him escape. The consequences were designed to be intimate, agonizing, and permanent. He was a pawn that had reached the end of the board, only to realize he was still playing for the other side. In the quiet hours of a Tuesday morning, he made a decision that shocked every intelligence agency involved. It was a move so counterintuitive, so contrary to the logic of the Cold War, that it was initially dismissed as a breakdown or a joke. He didn't ask for more protection. He didn't ask for a new identity or a move to a third country. He asked to go back. He knew that the only way to truly protect the secrets he actually cared about and the people tied to them was to return to the heart of the monster that had created him. He would walk back into the lion's den, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had looked at the bill for his freedom and decided the price was too high. In the rigid, unforgiving world of Soviet espionage, there was a script for everything. If a man betrayed the motherland, the script ended in a windowless cellar at Lefortovo with a 9mm round to the back of the head. It was the checkmate of the intelligence game, final, violent, and meant to serve as a gruesome deterrent to those left behind. But when the most dangerous defector of the late Cold War crossed back over the border, the script wasn't just ignored, it was shredded. There was no arrest at the border. There were no flashing lights, no heavy-handed KGB agents pinning him to the asphalt, and no cameras capturing a traitor's homecoming for the evening news. Instead, witnesses, whose reports would only surface decades later, recalled a strangely clinical scene. A black ZIL limousine sat idling on the tarmac of a restricted military airfield. A man stepped off a plane, walked calmly toward the car, and disappeared behind its curtained windows. He was not taken to a prison. He was not paraded before a military tribunal. He was quietly escorted to a restricted facility in the Golden Ring outside Moscow, a dacha that was technically a prison, yet looked like a sanatorium. In the official state records, his name was not marked with the scarlet letter of treason. He was simply listed as reassigned. Back in Washington and London, the intelligence community descended into a state of pure, unadulterated panic. The CIA and MI6 had spent years refining their psychological profiles of the Soviet leadership. They knew the Soviets were vengeful. They knew they were brutal. If this man wasn't being punished, if he wasn't being made an example of, then the terrifying truth was that the Soviets had gained something far more valuable than revenge. They hadn't brought him back to kill him. They had brought him back because the information he possessed was still active. The West realized with a cold, sinking feeling that the game hadn't ended with his return. It had merely moved into a phase they were never meant to understand. As the years progressed, the why behind this strange mercy began to emerge through the fog of counterintelligence. The defector wasn't a traditional spy, and he wasn't being treated as a traditional traitor. Western analysts, looking back at the debriefing transcripts from his time in Virginia, finally saw the trap they had walked into. The defector was being used by Moscow as a counterintelligence calibrator. In the high stakes of nuclear brinksmanship, the greatest unknown for the Kremlin wasn't the number of American missiles, it was the level of American understanding. They needed to know what the CIA knew. By allowing him to defect with a curated set of documents and then observing how the Americans reacted to that information, the Soviets were essentially pinging the Western intelligence radar. When he returned, he became the ultimate debriefing tool. He wasn't there to give up Western secrets, he was there to explain to the KGB exactly which parts of their salted documents the Americans believed, which parts they had questioned, and where their analytical blind spots lay. He didn't return as a man seeking forgiveness, nor as a spy seeking a new mission. He returned as data. He was a living test fire, a human probe that had been sent into the heart of the enemy's intelligence apparatus and brought back to report on the temperature of the room. He was the only man in history who could tell Moscow exactly how well their lies were working. By not killing him, the Soviets kept the most precise instrument they had ever possessed in perfect working order. Today, the story of the man who came back from the cold remains one of the most guarded secrets of the post-Soviet era. Even as other archives have opened and the names of legendary spies have been etched into history books, his ultimate fate remains a void. There was no grave in the famous Novodichi cemetery. There is no obituary in Pravda. There is no official record of a death sentence, a pardon, or a natural passing. He simply ceased to exist as a public entity the moment he stepped into that ZIL limousine. He became a non-person in the most literal sense, not through erasure, but through total absorption into the state's deepest shadows. Only one document has ever surfaced that provides a hint of his end. It is a single one-page memo found in a secondary archive, stamped decades later and hidden behind a series of bureaucratic veils. It contains no name, only a reference number that matches the defector's old GRU file. It contains a phrase that has haunted Western analysts since it was first whispered in the halls of Langley: subject, neutralized, without elimination. In the cold lexicon of the KGB, elimination is simple. It is the end of a life. But neutralization without elimination is something far more disturbing. It suggests a state of permanent living stasis. It suggests a man who was kept in a vacuum, his mind picked clean, his identity stripped away, until there was nothing left but the information he carried. That single line terrified analysts more than any execution ever could. It suggested that the Soviet Union had found a way to win the intelligence war not by killing their enemies, but by turning them into permanent, silent assets of the state, men who would never be dead, but would never truly be alive again.